This happened about 6 years ago, but to this day it still freaks me out. Back then, I was living on my own with a few friends in an apartment, but every so often I would go back to my mom's and just stay the night if I was too lazy to drive home. We had a few weird experiences before this, but nothing too scary. I think the scariest was when my sister had taken a selfie of herself in the mirror, and in the background you could see a figure of a woman in the background. But other than that, we are all used to weird paranormal stuff. My whole family are firm believers in it. But then there was this thing that had happened. I had stayed at my mom's house and fell asleep on the couch. I had woken up pretty early to my sister going to school and my mom going to work. Since it was pretty early and everyone was leaving, I moved to my mom's room to sleep a little longer before I left. Our family dog joined me and I slept a little while longer. When I woke up, I sat in bed on my phone and had the TV on. I was pretty lazy, so I sat in there until maybe 10:30 to 11 a.m., and that's when I heard it. My mom's room was on the second level, but it was only about 10 stairs up from the kitchen and dining room. From the kitchen, I could hear my mom yelling my name. I sat there for a second thinking I was hearing things, until I heard it 3 more times. At this point, my dog even perked up like he had heard it. I sat there, and then ran out of the room to investigate. I was creeped out because I hadn't heard anyone come home nor anyone walking around. I got up and looked from the top of the stairs. I didn't see anyone and called out for my mom. When she didn't answer, I went back into her room and called her. I asked if she stopped by for lunch and was trying to say hi. She said no and asked why. I told her, and she was creeped out but told me I should be fine. This continued to happen for about 4 years while they lived in the house. I moved back in, and around this time my sister went off to college out of state. I would go out to the garage late at night to smoke weed, and when I would sit there I could hear my sister's voice yelling "Mom" over and over again, and then it would stop. I would get freaked out and go back down to my room and would not hear it down there. I chalked it up to maybe me being high and paranoid, but still told my mom. That's when she told me she would hear the same thing when she would go out to the garage to smoke her cigarettes. She didn't want to tell me at first because she thought she was hearing things. The scariest part to me is that it would be in her exact voice. We have all moved out of that house since then, and it hasn't happened. But I want to know what paranormal thing was in that house. For context, I'm an 18-year-old male from Nevada, and I was 17 when this happened. 2 of my friends and I, we will call them Star, age 16, female, and Adriana, age 17, female, one day had a great idea to drive the 45-minute drive to go explore the Lovelock Cave. It was about mid-August, and it was about 6 in the afternoon when we came up with this idea. I was driving a '69 F100 at the time, and it had its issues. The starter was going out, my spark plugs were almost dead, and my timing was off. It was pretty hard to start, even when the engine was warm, let alone cold. Anyways, we decided to go to Lovelock. As we got to the base of the mountain, I crawled up the hill in the truck as far as I could because I'm the most athletic, lazy person to exist and didn't want to walk as much as possible. I get the truck up almost to the entrance to the cave and park it. By this time, the sun was setting and it was starting to get dark and cloudy. We got out of the truck and walked to the entrance of the cave. As we got to the entrance of the cave, we heard strange knocking coming from inside. We all just shook it off and kept going. We walked into the cave and started looking around for the supposed giant bones that were there when the cave was discovered. We kept going deeper and deeper into the cave and came across the mining platform. It's a platform made out of wood planks that was put there a long time ago. We then start hearing the knocking coming from closer to the entrance of the cave. We all looked at each other in disbelief, and goosebumps started to rise to the top of my skin. By now, Star and Adriana are looking at me to see what my facial expression was giving about the sound. The knocking started to turn into very quiet moaning sounds. The girls ran over behind me as we tried to exit the cave. As we were trying to leave the cave, the moaning sounds got louder. We couldn't seem to see where the noises were coming from, even though my big flashlight was lighting up the entire cave entrance. We slowly crept to the entrance of the cave and I shined my light around. I didn't see anything until I shined the light at my truck. I then see something so tall and deer-like standing on its hind legs. Its antlers were huge, almost that of a moose. I don't think the girls saw it at this point in time, so I shined my light away as quickly as possible. I told them to get down on their stomachs and crawl. We crawled away from the truck and stopped. We then heard heavy footsteps coming towards us. I then yelled at them to get up and start running. Following my light, I yelled as I started to get up and run. We all ran up and down the mountain, trying to lose whatever this was. We somehow made it back to my truck and got in and locked the doors. I fumbled with the keys to try to get them in the ignition, but I couldn't get it correct. After about 20 seconds of fumbling with my keys to get into the ignition, I finally got it. I turned the key and the truck didn't do anything. I knew what I had to do, but that meant I had to get out of the truck and tap the starter with the metal rod. I had someone sitting beside me in my seat. I rolled my window down slightly and shined my light to see if I could see the thing that we saw. I didn't see it, so I deemed it safe to go out of the truck and tap the starter. I very silently opened my heavy metal door and stepped out of the truck and walked to the other side. I got down onto the dirt on the back side of the front passenger tire and pushed my metal rod between the frame and the fender wall. I then tapped the starter a couple times and started to stand up. The girls started banging on the window, yelling and crying, pointing behind me. I didn't even look behind me before I started running to the other side of the truck to get back in. I heard the thing behind me breathing heavily and staring me down. I heard it start to run very quickly as I was approaching the other side of the truck. I opened my door, jumped in, and slammed it closed. I locked the door as quickly as possible before the thing was banging up against the side of my door. It seemed to have shifted figures, and it now looked like a decomposing human body. I turned the keys in the ignition, and the truck barely turned over. I let off the ignition and turned the key again. The truck struggled as it came to life with a roaring sputter of the engine. I turned my headlights on and tried to back out of the spot it was in. The thing was still banging on my door as I started to move. I put the pedal to the floor, and the thing acted like a deer in headlights as my lights hit it. It froze and looked at us with ferocious eyes. Scared, we all screamed like little girls. As I was backing down the hill, it started to chase. I got down the hill to a point where I could turn around and pull off a movie scene. Jay turned flawlessly. I threw it in first and gunned it with the thing still giving chase. I reached the top of my RPMs and slung it in second gear. Burning out on the dirt, I caused a huge dust cloud. The truck roared down the dirt road as we were all on the verge of tears. We got away from the dirt and onto the asphalt as the thing was losing us. I kept the throttle pinned to the floor and escaped. We got back home and we all did research to figure out what we saw. Now I'm not going to say it on this platform in fear that saying its name will cause it to show up again. Needless to say, we will never be going back to those caves, especially in the dark. This story happened about 20 years ago. I have not lived in the area for much of that time, so this is not current personal info. But I think that the location is relevant to the creepy feelings, and of course I encourage others to look up the references I bring up. I grew up on Long Island, New York. Many Long Island town names are Native American based, and I've heard they're pretty wild to pronounce for those who did not grow up there. Examples are Hauppauge, Patchogue, Copiague, Massapequa. Long Island is already home to creepy stories such as the Amityville Horror House. I have countless stories of myself or friends and family checking out historic places back then, such as shut-down asylums, haunted railway or highway crossings, Mary's Grave, and so on. And then, of course, there were random disappearances, some of which ended up being the Long Island Ripper, a case which recently got an alleged perpetrator. I didn't realize this at the time of this story, but the place my friends and I went to was in the same category as all of these unsettling things. To be clear, I have no idea if this was supernatural or not, but the history creeps me out either way. Every St. Patrick's Day, my mother, her friends, their kids, and any of my friends who wanted to tag along would go out to Montauk for the big parade. Montauk is gorgeous, and the sunset is allegedly famous. One of my mother's friends owned a room in another famous attraction, the Montauk Manor, and we all went to visit after a long day of shenanigans. My friends and I, being teenagers, still had energy to spare, so we asked if we could rent tennis rackets and just play around on the completely empty court. There were 4 of us, so we just played 2 versus 2 of whack the ball as hard as we could at each other. Most of the balls went over the massive chain-link fences because of our ridiculousness. I didn't want my mother's friend to get in trouble for us losing the balls, so I asked my friends to split up and collect them all. I think we had a batch of a specific number, maybe 10 or 20, so we knew how many to look for. I took the neighboring field and grumbled in teenage angst about why there would be a tall, wheat yellow grass field right next to a tennis court with a 10-foot-tall fence. I managed to find a lot of the balls we were looking for right on the edge of the tall grass. I tossed them behind me onto the asphalt and figured a bunch probably rolled into the field itself, so I went onto this neighboring property to look. I was alone, and I can't explain this any better, but I felt compelled to look up from my ground search and look out to the field. There was a large rock that stuck out from the 5-foot-tall grass, right in the middle of the field. Maybe 100 to 200 feet away, and although I had seen it before, I was stunned to see a figure sitting on top of this rock. I can see this in my mind to this day. It was a very lanky figure, I assume a male judging by the short hair, and either wearing a very tight shirt or nothing on top. Whatever the bottoms were, they looked like some sort of skirt or kilt that stopped around the knees. I can't describe much more because the figure was unnaturally dark, as if no light penetrated this strange silhouette, while the sun was still very much up and shined on both of us. I didn't register the darkness at first, because the second I looked up and my eyes locked onto this person, the figure quickly slid off of the rock. I saw the tall grass shaking towards my direction. My immediate thought was, oh crap, that's the farmer's son and I shouldn't be in this field. So I turned to make a quick exit. I went into the field on a diagonal, so when I turned it was a new path out as I tried to escape any potential consequences. And on the short route back, I skidded to a halt at an extremely disturbing sight. In a gap in the tall grass was a dead deer, and right next to it a very old-looking tennis ball, likely not one of ours. The sight made me freeze, and in the moment I did a quick scan to try to understand what I was seeing. I eventually focused on something I couldn't explain at the moment. There was a hole in its chest right between the front legs, but there was no blood, smell, or flies. This is where I lost whatever cool I had and started screaming to my friends to go, run! We needed to get out of there. The panic in my voice apparently convinced them very quickly. Back at the manor door, I explained what I saw. They were questioning why I screamed at them, especially when I insisted that we look for the tennis balls. But after explaining the deer, they were pale and silent, chalking it up to teenage energy and stupidity, and probably myself still running on adrenaline. My friends eventually said they needed to see this deer. I agreed to show them the area I was in. I told them we can try to find it again, but someone saw me on the property, so we shouldn't trespass or anything. After a good couple of minutes to calm down, we went back over and were still on the manor's asphalt paving, just peering around to see if we could spot the deer through the grass. My friend actually did, and we found out that it was 1 row away and easily visible if we used our arms to push some grass aside. I looked up again to look at the rock and to make sure the only grass that was moving was due to the wind. Then we stepped back into the field to get a good look at this thing. We were all creeped out by the lack of blood, despite a cavernous hole being there. There just wasn't any evidence of violence at all. There was nothing on the ground or around this hole on the fur, just a dark, empty space where fur and other things like tissue should be. After a couple of quiet minutes, someone said, "That's where the heart would be." I remember a coldness going over me, and suddenly I was no longer interested in what happened here. It felt to me like everyone got this feeling. We all left without another word to each other. After the shock wore off, and we were walking through the manor and back to my mother's friend's room, we talked about how crazy that is. But that was the last we spoke of it, until I Googled Long Island haunted places one day, years later. I don't remember the reasoning now, but knowing me, I was probably looking for a cool place to drive to that night. On the site, the Montauk Manor was listed, and that cold feeling washed over me again. I read about how the place was built upon countless Native American graves, how rituals were often done on the old and new grounds, and how shadow people were seen in the manor's hallways. We didn't see the latter, but the rest of it made me question a lot of what I saw that cold March day. I immediately messaged 2 of the friends who went with me, asking them, "Do you remember that time?" And they were absolutely baffled at the news. It's become a cool, niche legend for us, but at the same time, none of us have ever gone back. Long ago, we had a terrifying night. I had the most chilling experience of my life. I was 15 years old, living in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. It was a peaceful place, or so I thought, until that unforgettable night. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving me in the care of my older sister, Emma. She was 16 and loved the idea of being in charge. That night, we decided to watch a movie. Halfway through, there was a knock at the door. Emma paused the movie. We thought it was just a neighbor or a friend, but when she opened the door, there was no one there. We shrugged it off and went back to watch our movie. We weren't bothered because we thought it was just some of the other kids playing pranks. Later that night, I woke up to a weird tapping sound on my window. I was a bit scared because of the dark, but I mustered the courage to peek through the blinds. There, in the dim moonlight, I saw someone or something in all black standing in our backyard just staring at the house. My heart raced. I ran to Emma's room and woke her up. When we both looked again, the figure was gone. The next day, we told our parents about the incident, but they said it was probably just a lost traveler or a neighbor's guest. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The following night, the tapping returned, more persistent this time. It sounded like someone was intentionally trying to scare us. I told Emma and she called our parents, but there was no answer. We were alone and scared. Emma decided to call the police, but as soon as she picked up the phone, the tapping stopped. We felt relieved, but still uneasy. We tried to sleep, but a sudden loud bang from downstairs jolted us awake. Emma grabbed a flashlight and we tiptoed downstairs. The living room was a mess. Books from the shelves were thrown onto the floor and the couch cushions were scattered. Then we heard a whisper, a faint, eerie voice coming from the kitchen. It was singing a slow, haunting tune. Emma signaled for us to sneak back upstairs, but as we turned, the kitchen light flicked on by itself. We bolted upstairs, locked ourselves in my room, and pushed my dresser against the door. We huddled together, listening as footsteps started coming up the stairs, slow and heavy. They stopped right outside my room. The doorknob rattled gently, then more violently. We were trembling, holding each other tightly. The house went silent for a moment, then a voice, soft and raspy, spoke from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there, kids." We didn't respond. Then the sound of footsteps moving away from the door. We stayed awake the whole night. We were so scared to breathe. In the morning, our parents came back and found us asleep in my room, the dresser still blocking the door. We explained everything and they called the police. The officers found no signs of forced entry, but they did find footprints outside, beneath my window, and around the house. After that incident, my parents installed security cameras and an alarm system. The police patrols in our area increased, but the scariest part was that they never caught the person who stalked and terrified us that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear a faint tapping and I freeze, wondering if it's just my imagination or if my stalker has returned. So to start, this happened when I was 18 and I am currently 33. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky and I lived next to the senator of Kentucky, who had bought our neighborhood when it was all just old farmland woods. So she had bought this land back in the 70s before she was the senator. She had a lot of money from her parents. That was just a little backstory to understand why and how I lived next to her. When I was 18, my yard had backed up to the senator's house and I worked her farmland and did chores around her land just to make some extra cash in the summer. The senator had massive amounts of land still that backed up into unused public land that went for miles and miles, mainly tiny streams, fields, and trees, nothing too exciting. It was next to a small highway, and we had to cross it to get to the next part of the woodlines. My friend, who we will call Auntie, also did the chores and land work, and he had a little brother as well, who we will call Willie, and he was about 15. We all grew up in an area that was pretty safe, so our parents let us do whatever we wanted and would tell us to be back at a decent time. We often explored these lands during the day to see how far we could go or even find anything in the woods that would be pretty cool to explore. Usually we found nothing, some makeshift campsites for what we assumed was hunting and just camping. One day we went pretty close to dusk and we happened to bring flashlights just in case it got too dark. This was during the fall of 2008 and the leaves were falling and it was coating the ground pretty thick with leaves. As we were walking, I started to notice we had been going in a circle, and I assumed we were lost, and we could no longer hear the highway that was close to us. The sun was going down pretty quick, and we only had maybe about an hour left of light. It eventually got dark, and we started walking around in the woods with our flashlights. It quickly got darker and darker, and it was around 10 p.m. at this time, and we were still lost. Before anyone asks why we didn't call with our cell phones, I grew up a relatively modest life and my parents only gave me a flip phone, and service back then was crappy. Throughout the night, we were trying our best to find the way we came, but it was near impossible in the dark and very thick woods. My dad always told me when in the woods, if it became extremely quiet at any point, that means there was a much larger predator in the area, Now, mind you, we are technically in the Appalachia area, and we have all heard the stories of what not to do while in the woods, specifically at night. Auntie, Willie, and I were walking, and suddenly everything in the area got extremely quiet, except for one noise, and that was a whistling sound. We all stopped dead in our tracks and began to look around in every direction in an attempt to verify where it was coming from. Unknowingly, Auntie whistled back, and we all know you are not supposed to whistle back in the woods, especially at night, in the Appalachia regions of the world. I hit Auntie with my hand and asked him, "Why would you do that?" And the whistling started to grow louder and louder, so I told everyone to start running. As we were running, the whistling got softer and softer, and eventually it went away. If we weren't lost before, we are now. As we are wandering around, it's around midnight now, and it's a full moon, and it's lighting the area somewhat well. We happened to walk up on a shanty, which is an old run-down shack. It looked like it still had somewhat of a door on it, and through the door we could see a small fire going. As any dumb white person would do, we opened the door and asked if anyone was around. At that moment, we heard leaves crunching, and we all turned around, and nothing was there. As if it was a horror movie, the whistling started again, and it sounded like it was right next to us. We all turned towards the sound, and there she was. A woman in torn-up clothing and a really crappy appearance. She was about 5 feet from us. We slightly shifted back some, and we just looked at her with the flashlights pointing at her. We said, "Hello?" As if something we said made her lose her mind, she began screaming extremely loud. This wasn't a normal screaming, like it was primal. She lunged at Auntie, and out of reaction, Auntie swung his flashlight directly into the lady's face, and she fell to the ground. We started to run because we were terrified, and she began to chase after us while still screaming. We were hauling ass through the woods for at least 15 minutes, and she is still chasing us. We eventually lost her, or so we thought. We took a break behind some bushes, and we started hearing the whistling again. We sat there for at least an hour before we worked up the courage to keep running. We started running, and we could hear someone close to us as well, running. No longer did we hear the whistling, but we only assumed she was near us. We started to hear the highway again, and finally got to the highway. Assuming she was still chasing us, we got as close as we could to the highway and flagged someone down. We were terrified she was waiting in the wood line and was frantically waving people down, and the cars were scarce. No one stopped. Finally, someone stopped and let us in. He was pretty spooked because our faces were extremely pale, and he asked what had happened. We explained, and he told us that a lot of homeless, mentally incompetent people and drug users live in these woods. This happened a few years ago in southwest Georgia, about an hour and a half south of Atlanta. My mom was a police officer at the time, and she told me the following. So they get a call to one of the bad parts of town, and it came from a father who said his daughter was on drugs. So my mom, we will call her Kay, and her partner, call her D, walk into the house and find the daughter sitting on one of those old school couches with the legs that make it stand about 4 to 6 inches off the ground. So the woman is sitting there just blankly staring in front of her. My mom said the woman suddenly started freaking out and screaming, "He's right there! He's right there! He's coming!" So K and D start to reach towards the woman to calm her. Suddenly, it's as if something under the couch grabs the woman and tries to yank her underneath the couch. Kay said that there's no way the woman could have faked this by the way her ankles bent underneath her and the force behind it. So K and D grab the woman and are literally playing tug-of-war with whatever was pulling this woman. Suddenly, and as quickly as it started, the force just stops. The woman is screaming and crying, and the father is still just saying his daughter is crazy and on drugs. So they take the woman to the hospital. Here's where it gets even more crazy. So the hospital did a drug test and found no drugs in this woman's system. It turns out this woman went to a local church earlier in the evening begging for help. But the church turned her away thinking she was on drugs as well. Anyway, the woman gets admitted to the psychiatric ward for a few days. What happens next is going to sound fake, but I swear on my kids it's not. A few days later, the house burns to the ground. Nobody was inside, thankfully. The woman was still admitted, and the father got out before it was too late. They were unable to determine the cause of the fire. I recently met my mom's old partner, Dee, and asked her to tell the story because I didn't fully believe my mom. Well, she recounted it almost identically to how my mom did, with the exception of her saying that when they had a hold of the woman on the couch, she remembers just repeating the Lord's Prayer over and over and over. She said she's never booked it so fast out of a house in her life. This story crosses my mind at least once a week and scares me still every single time. Okay, so I used to live in an old house. It was about 100 years old. It was 4.5 acres of land, very old farmhouse, and the people who had lived there before my grandmother had a daughter. I don't know whether this story is completely 100% accurate, but what I was told was the girl was having a birthday party and she was jumping on her bed. She had then fallen out of the second-story window at the time. That window was in my grandmother's room. I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling someone staring at me and breathing down my neck. I would sit up and look at the doorway and I would see the figures. Sometimes there would be 3 of them. Sometimes there would only be 1. But most of the time it was just the small-looking one and the shorter adult-looking one. I was little then, so I was kind of freaked out. But then I realized that she was just a kid too, and I thought maybe she wanted to be my friend. So when I would wake up in the middle of the night, I would start talking to her. I don't know if she ever heard me or was actually interested, but it seemed as if she could understand me, and one day she just disappeared. I don't know where she went, but time skipped to a couple years later when I was 13. My parents told me we were moving, and after they told me that, I started waking up in the middle of the night again and seeing her in the doorway. It kind of freaked me out as it did in the past, but then I remembered she would just stand there and look at me sometimes. I swear I could see her blink, but I guess that was just her way of saying goodbye. I think about this all the time. My parents and my sister call me crazy because they don't believe in ghosts or paranormal things, but the night before I actually left for good, a couple of strange things happened. I woke up in the middle of the night like usual and saw nothing in the doorway, but then I looked around my room in the dark and saw her at the foot of my bed. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, and then she was gone. I thought it was weird at the time because usually she would only stand in the doorway, but I heard something after she disappeared. It was a faint whisper, and I could have sworn she said goodbye. It sounded sad, like you would never see that person again. A sad type of goodbye. I thought it was rather sweet. I whispered goodbye too and fell back asleep. Looking back on it the next day, I thought it was a dream. But a year later, as I'm writing this, it wasn't a dream. Honestly, it kind of creeped me out, but it's also kind of sweet, if you think about it. I've lived in the same house for over 12 years before I moved out. It was an innocent vintage house that lay on top of a hill. We had a maid that usually cleaned our house once a month. She was nice, and we were close with her. We were quite surprised when she said she was quitting. We kept asking her why, but she wouldn't tell us except to say that she wasn't comfortable with telling us. We were beyond confused. After lots of begging, she finally told us what made her want to quit. She said that while she was cleaning the house, she saw a girl in a white dress with long black hair that covered her face. We all had dirty blonde hair, and we weren't home at the time she was cleaning the house. We were super freaked. That night, when I was in bed, it suddenly got really cold. I hugged the nearest pillow next to me and prayed that it would keep me warm. That morning, I woke up and found a long black lock of hair in my bed. The pillow I was hugging was on the opposite side of the room. My siblings pranked me a lot, so I automatically assumed they were messing with me. So I ran downstairs into their rooms and told them that it wasn't funny. They denied it, but I didn't believe them. That was until they told me they weren't home last night and just got back this morning. They were both at a sleepover with their friends. I knew my parents wouldn't do this, so I immediately was freaked out. Since that moment, everyone refused to sleep over, claiming that they would see a girl of the exact description of our maid staring at them. I would keep waking up with strands of hair in my bed. It got so bad to the point where I started sleeping in my parents' room. We moved out now, but I soon found out that way back a serial killer lived in our house and he buried his victims under his house, and that he preferred little girls. Years ago, maybe 2006 or 2007, I took my girlfriend, now wife, to the movies. We were just out of high school. We decided to see The Exorcism of Emily Rose against her mother's advice. We made it through half of the movie. She wasn't enjoying it at all, and neither was I. We headed out early, and since we had some time left, we decided to head to a park next to her house and just hang for a bit before I had to drop her off. We parked my truck, I took the keys out of the ignition and sat them on my lap. A few seconds after this, the radio comes on and the LCD display is just showing weird symbols. There is a very deep voice coming from the speakers. It was really loud and clear, but the words it was saying weren't English, and neither of us understood what it was saying. We proceed to jump out of the truck, kind of freaking out. After the scary movie, we were uneasy, and this was just over the top. When we hopped out, the radio shut off and the voice stopped. After a few minutes, we decided we should head to her house. She lived less than a block away, so we sped over there. Once there, I had the strangest feeling like someone was right behind me and/or watching me. I was really scared at this point. It was just so odd. I called my mom, told her that I couldn't explain now, but I wouldn't be home tonight and I would tell her more in the morning. No way I was driving that truck home alone in the dark. We sat for a while with her family, and I asked her mom if I could stay the night there. Her dad said I could share a room with her brother. Fast forward to when we were going to sleep. Her brother gave me the bed and slept on the floor, facing away from me and towards the door. After a bit sitting there propped on my elbow facing the door, all of a sudden it got very cold and I couldn't move or talk. Into the doorway walks a silhouetted figure that was black like smoke with solid white eyes and appeared to have dreadlocks and a high ponytail. It stood in the doorway for what seemed like forever, staring straight in my eyes, and then turned and walked into the bathroom. As soon as it leaves the door, I can move again. I have to know if it's in the bathroom at this point. I nervously get up and get out of the bed. Her brother startles me by asking, "What are you doing?" And I say I have to go to the bathroom. Nothing was there. Since in that movie the weird stuff always happened at 3:30 a.m. For the next 4 years or so, almost every night I woke up at 3:30 with the same someone watching me feeling. I chalked it up to sleep paralysis and a weird tech glitch, and the rest of me being paranoid and anxious about it. I've told all my friends over the years, and about 2 years ago decided to tell my brother-in-law. He was dumbfounded when I told him and said that he remembers that night very clearly, because he was frozen and saw the same thing. So what the heck? Anyone have something similar? So this story takes place in late 2016, the year Pokemon Go came out. At the time, this game had huge hype around it, so me being a teenager who wanted to play what everyone else was playing, I got the game myself and I enjoyed it. One of my friends also played the game, and we had the idea of having a sleepover at my house and having our own Pokemon adventure together. We both thought it was going to be a lot of fun. So we got it organized, and my friend, who I will call Dan, stayed over at my house. For the day, we messed around, ate snacks, and played video games on my PS4. It was at 10 p.m. when Dan suggested we go out and play Pokemon Go. I brought up that it was too late, but he persisted. So I asked my mom if it was fine, and she said it was. Sure, I had my concerns and all, but I honestly thought nothing bad would happen. This was due to the fact I live in a small and quiet town. No one would be out this late, so it wasn't like we were going to get mugged in an alley. So we grabbed our phones and headed off down the main street of my town. We walked past the cemetery, then past the football oval. But as we passed the football oval, we saw a black Ford Territory parked by it. No lights were on, so we didn't think anyone was inside of it, so we walked past it. We got onto the footpath past the oval when we noticed the Ford pull up next to us on the footpath. We found it strange, but kept walking. Anyway, we were passing the post office when we saw the same Ford pull into the car park in front of the post office. This gave us the suspicion this random car was following us. So we kept walking, but at a faster pace. We walked past the post office and were now walking past our town park. As we were walking by the park, Dan told me to hide behind the bushes, which surrounded the park entrance. As we crouched down behind the bushes, we saw the Ford pull in at the park entrance, confirming 100% that this Ford was following us. After what felt like an eternity for me, the Ford drove off and we got out of the park and started running back to my house. As we started running back to my house, I looked behind me to make sure the Ford was gone, and what I saw horrified me. The car turned left at the end of the street. I originally thought that maybe he was just leaving the town, but then I realized this park has 2 main entrances. The way he turned, he was driving to the second entrance. This meant he believed we ran to the other side of the park and was trying to cut us off that way. There was no argument left. This guy wasn't following us for safety purposes. He was chasing us. I am not an athletic person, unlike my friend Dan, but in this instant I was keeping up with him from the sheer fear of what would happen if this driver caught us, or what his intentions were with us. We ran past the post office, past the football oval, and we were halfway past the cemetery when we saw the headlights of the Ford behind us, and I was terrified. There was nowhere to hide. It was a footpath, With a giant fence separating the footpath and the cemetery, there was nothing to hide behind. Luckily enough, Dan came up with an idea. He pointed out we were both wearing dark hoodies. He said to put the hood over our heads, crouch down, and pretend to be rocks. At the time, I thought it was an absolutely stupid idea, but that was all we had. So we did just that, pretended to be rocks. And the Ford drove past us, not slowing down at all, which meant this stupid plan actually worked. After he drove past, we continued booking it. We were at the end of the cemetery when we saw him driving our way again. This time there was a bin to hide behind, which we did. He drove past us again and we continued booking it. We got to my house and locked the door behind us to ensure some kind of safety. We explained to my mom what happened, and after that day she made some new rules. No more playing Pokemon Go at night, and my little sister was not allowed to go out by herself to play it. She wasn't happy about that, but at least we are still here to tell this story.